Hello and welcome. You're joining the exchange, and the topic of digital economies is something that comes up ever so often in the Sri Lankan landscape. And to broach on that topic, we have with us here today Dr. Wijayasuriya, the Chief Advisor to the President on Digital Economies. Hello and welcome.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So you're taking up on this role, this pro bono role rather, so after a distinguished career at Axiata and Dialogue before that as well. So just to kick things off, what personally drives you to digitalize and be in these efforts to digitalize Sri Lanka?
I think to begin with, I have a great belief that digital and technology more generally can be a key lever, if not the principal lever, in transforming our economy and also transforming lives in Sri Lanka. In particular, leveling the asymmetries that exist across various segments of society in terms of access to basic services, the convenience of accessing government services or even other forms of services. And even more importantly, I have a strong belief and trust that the people of Sri Lanka, every single citizen in this country, has a great appetite as well as a great capability and innate belief in adopting technology and adopting it to make life better. So with that belief, I think we have an excellent opportunity to leverage new technologies which are becoming cheaper, more accessible, more open, to solve a variety of problems, beginning with the core economy and all the way to development outcomes as well.
So what has the roadmap looked like so far, and what roadmap do you have in mind for the next 5 years at least, till the mandate of this government is done?
Mix of foundational work that we have to focus on, building, architecting first of all, the digital economy blueprint, and from there to build the foundational elements of the digital economy blueprint, starting with accelerating expansion of the broadband networks, the computing and storage infrastructure like cloud, the government cloud as well as the private clouds. And one layer above that, bringing in what is, I would say, substantially new form of infrastructure, which is digital public infrastructure, including among others the digital ID, the national data exchange, etc. So the architectures need to be set up, blueprinted and set up, and then the build has to commence. But you might say these are foundational, they'll take some time, and they need to be balanced with quick win unlock opportunities, which we have been addressing, and there's a wide spectrum of unlock opportunities which have been captured already, and similarly a roadmap of these into the rest of the year.
Now, when we take the population of Sri Lanka, there's a big portion of it that belongs to rural communities, right? Communities that have traditionally not had access to the latest and greatest of technology. So how would you say your blueprint is for ensuring that these DPI or digital public infrastructure remain accessible to all communities and all people of Sri Lanka?
I think I kicked off by talking about eradicating gaps, eradicating asymmetries, and therefore a blueprint which is fundamentally by design inclusive. So that fundamental will go across all our activities, and inclusion would then attack existing gaps. How do we eradicate existing asymmetries, for example, access to education, etc., but also ensure that going forward, and I'll talk about DPI now, going forward, that the technologies that we introduce and the innovation that we do will not leave anyone behind or create new gaps. So how do we ensure this? DPIs by nature are open. They are nearly in all cases open sourced, and therefore they are freely available, and also have been architected in a way that they can be used by in a very simple format, intuitive, and can be reached by, from a literacy perspective, by a wide spectrum of citizens. Now, reach itself That's where broadband infrastructure, which again I mentioned in the context of the blueprint, broadband infrastructure needs to be made ubiquitously available, also to the required quality and capacity. So that would be a major thrust within this inclusion dimension. Add to that, the DPIs are mostly, or I would say nearly all, accessible via a mobile phone. So Sri Lanka has a penetration, penetration over 140%. But even if we take unique user penetration or unique adult penetration, it's well into the 90s. So therefore, there's more work to be done in terms of moving the smartphone penetration from around 70% all the way closer to 100% smartphone penetration over the next 3 to 5 years. But I would say the main tool that DPIs adopt or digital public infrastructures adopt to reach the citizen is the mobile phone, and that is a tool which Sri Lanka has led the region over the past years in terms of inclusion as well, in terms of affordability, in terms of availability, as well as the trust which citizens have in using a phone.
When we're talking about broadband coverage in Sri Lanka, so Sri Lanka is at a stage where we're actively rolling out 5G. We still see areas that are still not covered by 4G in Sri Lanka as well. So how do you how do you plan to bring that uniformity to ensure that while we are working on getting the latest and greatest technology down here, we ensure that each citizen has access to at least a 4G connection, which is pretty much a prerequisite for any digital activity in this day and age?
I think that's an excellent KPI you have already set, and I think the Digital Economy Ministry, the TRC, and the overall digital economy thrust will focus on ensuring that every citizen has, at a minimum, a good quality 4G access. 5G has been operated so far in pilot mode by the mobile operators, but licensing has not been done yet for the 5G specific spectrum, and that is something we need to do pretty soon, and the TRC is committed to do this within the next few months, and this would, I think, set the stage for a new wave of broadband expansion. But you're right that 5G will not solve the inclusion problem immediately, and therefore there has to be a focus on 4G, on physical infrastructure, meaning the towers across all parts of the country, backhaul, meaning fiber or other forms of backhaul. And that's where 5G in fact can play a dual role, both in terms of mobile 5G, but also in terms of providing backhaul capabilities as well as in the fixed domain. So I'm very confident that a 5G wave, albeit late, Sri Lanka is late on 5G. If we had continued the same momentum we had with 3 and 4G, I think we would have mature 5G infrastructure today. But never too late to catch up, so that's the focus.
Because of the lack of usage or lack of interest in it altogether, or is it technological constraints?
I don't think it's technological constraints, because Sri Lanka is very lucky that the 3.5G spectrum is clean in Sri Lanka. Many of the countries that I worked in my previous life, 3.5 had to be cleared. There were satellite transmissions in this band, and there's a lot of hard work to be done. Sri Lanka was very lucky. To give credit to the administration, pilot networks are permitted, but for whatever reason, I wouldn't know why, but for whatever reason 5G was not licensed. I think there are administrative reasons, not any technological reason.
Let's draw a bit of attention to our neighbors, India. I think that's a prime example of an economy that has been, to a certain extent or a considerable extent, demonetized, right? We see so much chit-chat in our landscape about how India demonetized and why we can't do it. Along with all of these questions, more often than not, we see the conversation of their Aadhaar and their PAN come up. So how do you think Sri Lanka will implement this digital ID system? Do we need a new system altogether, or are we a country that already, as a country rather, that already has an established identification system? Can we work from what we have, or do we have to bring in what they did?
It's the question, and also a very long one. So let me unpack it a bit. First of all, is India the best model to follow in terms of digital ID? The architecture in India is DPI based. So the ID itself is a key digital public infrastructure. However, Aadhaar grew organically over, I think, the last 13 years or so, and Sri Lanka doesn't have the luxury of 13 years. Our target is to get the digital ID up and running across the population within 2 years, and then to enable the spawning of multiple citizen services across government and the private sector in the period immediately following. The system that we have adopted is inspired by Aadhaar. It is not Aadhaar. It's called 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗏, the modular open source identity platform. And let me just dial back to some of the key objectives and beliefs and fundamental guidelines that we set ourselves in selecting the way forward on digital ID. The first was that it should be inclusive, meaning that it's simple to use, it can be rolled out rapidly across the country. Second, that it should be very, very secure, trusted, and also provide a 100% safe environment. Third, that it should be vendor neutral, that it should be open, and therefore not lead to Sri Lanka's entire digital economy ecosystem being locked into a particular vendor or a particular country or any particular technology. Also, in terms of technology, we set the belief that it should be world class, that Sri Lanka's digital ID would be a beachhead as well as a global benchmark when it comes into operation. So with these ambitious beliefs and guidelines and, in a sense, boundary conditions, we landed on an open source system, a system which is proven, has already some 120 plus million registered citizens in multiple countries, innately secure by design, meaning it has been built on the principles of privacy, trust, and cybersecurity in its design itself. Also, that being open sourced, it has been nourished and made increasingly robust in its capabilities and its security through the collaboration and inputs of developers from across the world, and also backed by institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and various other international organizations. So this was the start. That it's open, it won't be restricted to any particular vendor or country or technology. So then you ask me the question, what do we use from our starting point, which is our NIC and the existing identity system. We are very fortunate that, unlike where India was in 2013 or 2012, where they did not have an ID card, and there was no culture of identity, a culture of proving your identity or authenticating yourself, which we do today with our, in a physical sense, we show our ID card. So Sri Lanka is one step ahead, that we all believe in identity and protecting our identity. The systems, however, don't meet those requirements. If I were to answer your question very briefly, the existing systems do not meet all those guidelines that I mentioned before. Being vendor neutral, being resistant to any form of vendor locking. They are not open source. They haven't gone through the rigor of security by design or privacy by design. and therefore moving to a world-class system which comes pretty much free of charge because it is open source, can continue to be improved by Sri Lanka's developer community because it is open source. Sri Lankan developers, Sri Lankan innovators can participate in the future development of the ID platform, not only for Sri Lanka but for other countries in the MOSIP world as well. So for these reasons and many others, moving to a world-class platform which is open source makes a lot of sense. However, we are not going to throw away the workflows and the systems which have been developed within the ID, the Department of Registration of Persons, which will feed into the world-class platform that we will establish.
When we take this ID, digital ID system, I wouldn't be surprised if this comes with a bit of skepticism from the public about how secure is this? Can the government track me? You know, those are the kind of questions that we see coming from the public. So how do you plan to address this and, you know, create trust, create public trust in the digital system?
The entire ecosystem, meaning the mix of the technology itself and embedding privacy, security, safety into the technology itself by design. So there are privacy enhancing technologies, for instance, which will be incorporated. In terms of the safety, there would be multiple gates of cyber security checking, not only prior to launch, but there would be a continuous red teaming and penetration testing process which is in place going forward after launch as well. That's on the tech itself. And in terms of the laws governing this, there is the Registration of Persons Act, there is also the Personal Data Protection Act, and the Data Protection Authority, which will be the regulator to ensure that citizen privacy is maintained. Over and above that, there are all the constitutional protections which citizens have, and the ecosystem, the laws and the institutions have to collectively ensure that the use of the ID is for the purpose it is put in place. Let me also just take the opportunity to clarify a little bit on what digital ID is. The form of digital ID that we are architecting for Sri Lanka is a combination of a physical identity, I'll come to what that comprises of, and a digital credential, which the digital credential is basically a pseudo-random number which you would use in the internet, in the cyberspace. You don't even need to know that number, but that's your ID in cyberspace. Now the physical ID, the improvements to the previous ID is that demographic data like your name and address and gender, etc., will be now strengthened using your biometrics. So the physical form of data, which should be now fully encrypted and digitally stored and used for authentication, it has to be tightly coupled with the digital credential. It's only when the digital credential and the physical ID are tightly coupled that you have what we loosely call as digital ID. What does this enable? It enables a phygital journey for citizens. You could, for instance, use your QR code. A digital ID doesn't really need a card in the first place, but you could even just present your QR code for someone to authenticate you using a simple QR scan. There would be other instances where you need to provide your biometrics, for instance your thumbprint, to obtain a SIM card. There's no other authentication you need to do. You just give your thumbprint and everything else will be done for you. If you're not physically present, if you're on the other end of a device or a computer, then there would be, for instance, face recognition or even thumbprint or other biometric verification you can do through your device. So this would enable you to authenticate yourself equally whether or not you're there in person. And this enables one of the fundamental paradigms of an advanced digital economy, which is presenceless, to enable you to do nearly everything, whether it be with government or with a private organization or with another citizen, completely presenceless, which would add to, of course, efficiencies, convenience, and so on.
When addressing the public and the public trust in the system, I believe another key important factor would be education and how aware they are of how this works. Now, with Sri Lanka looking to digitalize our core government systems, do you think Sri Lankan citizens, Sri Lankan students have enough when it comes to education at the school level in terms of ICT?
The Education Ministry, to my knowledge, is going through a complete curriculum reform, and obviously it will be centered on a much higher degree of ICT and even AI education. For instance, even recently there have up to, I think, more than 100 AI clubs have been instituted in schools. Now that is, you could say, informal capacity building, but it needs to get formalized, you're very right, and the curriculum needs to improve or be modernized to the extent of making the students A, capable, and B, employable in a society which is far more digitalized than it is today, looking 3 years down the road. Trust and digital literacy, yes, go hand in hand, and in parallel with education reform, what is also important is that there's continuous education through media, through volunteerism, through structured approaches to exposing students, youth, and all segments of society to these technologies, again using inclusion as a key parameter, that it should apply equally across the country. This is an ideal world, it doesn't exist today, and it is something that we, and I am personally committed to ensure that no one would stand up in 5 years and say, this is all great, but this segment of the society has been completely left out. That would be a major failure on our part if that happens.
So with Sri Lanka, once again, coming back to what our objective is and what our goal is, with Sri Lanka looking to completely digitize government services and look towards a complete digital economy, do you think our existing laws, especially on data protection, are enough? Because we have seen multiple occasions, even very recently, where companies or large, mainly companies, because these are the main factions of society that currently use digital systems, get away with things like data protection blunders. So do you think the existing laws are enough, or we need a reform on that front as well?
Personal Data Protection Act is it's a strong piece of legislation. The institutional framework will be introduced, or rather get activated in phases commencing October. So the activation of the institutions will provide that front-facing vehicle to protect citizens. I believe the PDPA is a strong legislation. It might need some adaptation as we move into the world of AI, etc. But that in itself is a strong piece. Now, the accompanying legislation, which is equally important, is what you alluded to, which is cybersecurity related legislation, and that is going through the final stages of drafting as we speak. And this would lead to a regulatory authority, the Cybersecurity Authority, which would have the powers to regulate both the private and public sectors in terms of their readiness, cybersecurity readiness, as well as their practices and operating procedures for the protection of citizen data. Now, why the PDPA in particular and data protection in particular becomes even more important in the digital economy framework that we envisage is that a fundamental difference between how government institutions work today and the future state within the digital economy blueprint is that there would be a considerable amount of data sharing, so that we could apply the principles of data minimization, meaning that a form that you have to fill digitally will have only the minimum set of data which you have not ever given previously for the carrying out of a particular task. So you give data only once, you will give your biometrics only once, and so on. That's a key principle of ask once, and secondly data minimization. Now, how you might ask me then, if data is minimized and you need to provide it only once, how would everything get done? And that is through the interoperability layer, which would go across the various government systems. And this would require one government system or even a private sector system like a bank to request for some of your personal data which they themselves do not have in their database. And that would pass through the National Data Exchange, which would have within it a consent platform, which would that would mean that the consent platform seeks your authorization to share data between two entities. And this whole process gets regulated by the Data Protection Authority. So that's where not only the infrastructure of a national data exchange and a consent platform become crucial, the laws, the PDPA, and the implementation and enforcement of that law via the Data Protection Authority all need to come into place to assure you that the convenience that you enjoy in that scenario does not in any way compromise your right to control the use of your data.
When it comes to digital economies and demonetization, I think digital payment systems are very important, and ease of use is very important as well. And we see two major players globally, Apple's Apple Pay and Google's Google Pay. Now, neither of these systems are currently active in Sri Lanka, and we have all the infrastructure to do so. Our mobile phones have it, and the card machines at shops do have that technology as well. So why do you think, what is stopping us from making that initial move, getting these companies to look at Sri Lanka and enable that technology? I mean, obviously the government will have to intervene because these are big technologies and there's a lot of law and a lot of processes around it. Is this in the government's plans currently, or is this something we should have done 5 or 10 years ago?
No, absolutely. And I think the advocacy with these major global players is something which has taken place to my knowledge and continues to be very aggressively addressed. And the same goes for PayPal and the various other global systems which have, should I say, release schedules in terms of their roadmap for entering different markets. Our regulatory environment is sufficiently progressive to welcome these players, so there's no block there. And as we say, the technology is ready. So it's more about the advocacy, and if there are any concerns around cybersecurity, etc., I think they'll be well addressed with the emerging regulatory environments and the protection environments. So from a readiness perspective, I don't see Sri Lanka being deficit in this framework. It's the advocacy that's required to attract these players to open up to the smaller markets. Sri Lanka is not the only small market which has this issue of being down the release cycle. So we need to keep pushing on that. But looking at demonetization, I think it's one of the tools, but it needs to come hand in hand with, as you said, the ease of use of digital payment instruments. And in addition to tap and pay or NFC, near field communication based payments, QR payments are also a source of having low cost a payment vehicle for low cost small micro transactions. And this is again a topic which, together with the central bank and Lanka Pay, the Digital Economy Ministry is addressing from a point of view of looking at why adoption in Sri Lanka is not as should I say, doesn't have the momentum that you see in neighboring countries. So is it to do with the fees? Is it to do with the experience? Is it to do with availability? Is it to do with literacy, education of merchants, and so on and so forth? So there's a advisory group comprising of very senior stakeholders from across, all the way from the banks to the NBFIs to fintechs and the mobile players, coming together to crack their head on what would it take to turn it around. On the positive side, the payment rails, the payment technologies in Sri Lanka, which have been largely developed by Lanka Pay under the guidance of central bank, are pretty advanced, and there's very little, I believe, to really improve in terms of the technology architecture itself. But making sure that the experience to the citizen is superlative, that the trust level is very high, and that digital is, if not cheaper, no more expensive than cash. If you want to move from cash to digital, there has to be a compelling reason, and we need to make sure that's the case.
Have you all identified reasons as to why there is a lack of momentum? Because we've seen this, as you said, Lanka QR being active for years at this point, and if we look at our neighbors which have much less infrastructure to begin with, which had much less infrastructure to begin with, adopt this and use it even at a level where even a roadside vendor has a QR code.
Yes.
Yeah. So any reasons that you have?
I think many. I wouldn't want to conclude at this stage. It's a value chain or ecosystem problem, and you need to really study every node in the chain, and whether there is either, as I mentioned, either literacy or cost or convenience gap, or is it something which is endemic across, and what policy levers can be used to unlock, and what citizen education levers, merchant education levers, what incentives, what investments need to be done to unlock it. My gut feel here is that this will not involve major investments, because the payment technologies are good. My gut feel is that moving from gut to absolute data, which is what we are doing, collecting data at each node, it should be possible to crack this through a few policy and commercial levers.
On the process of catching up with the rest of the world, at least the developed countries, how are you going to ensure that the technologies that we are building today in the process of catching up remain sustainable by the time we have caught up? If we are investing so much time and financially to these projects that we're doing now, I don't see it being feasible if in 15 years time, by the time the implementation becomes fruitful, if it's outdated, right? So how are you ensuring that we are working on what's sustainable and not playing a game of catching up and, sort of going continuously trying to catch up with the rest of the world?
There would always be a technology risk, an obsolescence risk. I think that's given, but how do you ensure that you mitigate that risk to the maximum extent possible? And this lies in the fundamental by design principles that have been incorporated. If you go with open source as a fundamental belief, then the fact that open source communities continue to innovate the platforms. For instance, the digital ID, the core platform, will continue to be innovated with global input. That in itself is a security against immediate technology obsolescence. Building in certain principles such as AI first, cloud first, mobile first, I think will buy us, again, a significant period of protection against technology obsolescence. So it has to be by design, and using also an API first approach, meaning that you have these DPIs and infrastructures which are open, and you expose APIs, application program interfaces, which developers can use, which a private sector can use, and you have a living technology ecosystem, not some systems which are vendor locked, which you need to pay license fees, which have release dates, etc. You have a living digital economy ecosystem. That's the, I believe, the best way of protecting against technology obsolescence.
We saw Sri Lanka recently implement the card-based system for traffic fine payments, spot fine payments. With this, we saw some resistance coming from the postal department, which traditionally carried out the fine collection and the fine payment system. So not this specific issue, but in general, we have seen the government sector historically being very much against modernization or digitalization and wanting to stick to traditional methods. Why do you think that is, and also how do you plan to overcome this going forward?
The resistance to change is in all of us, I think, and even operating in the private sector, you face resistance to change, and that's a human, innate human weakness. That but why do you resist? It's often because you don't fully understand, or you have not been fully briefed or fully educated, and that is on us. To ensure that every stakeholder across the public sector and the private sector really understand the big picture. The fact that we are attempting or envisioning growing the digital economy in Sri Lanka from around 3% of total, meaning around $3 to $4 billion today, to $15 billion in 5 years, which means a 5x growth in digital economy. And through that to uplift GDP growth, which will trickle down. Going to the micro level of individual institution, we need to take the time to educate, explain, and build belief that while you give some, you might lose something. But on the other hand, digital transformation will enable you to do much more and play a new role in this big picture. So change management, I believe, is one of the top priorities. And just to put some numbers to it, I recognize technology as just 25% of the problem, or of the solution. Technology is hardly the reason that we have not progressed fast or rapidly prior to this. The rest is in change management, in process re-engineering, and in sensitivity and a passion for citizen experience. So these three dimensions which are beyond technology, having every member of the public sector and private sector committed to delivering an excellent service to the citizen and to the business. And in terms of business experience, we are talking of the ease of doing business, which would drive FDIs, which would drive trade, etc. So the challenge of building belief, delivering, enabling change management, redesigning processes, and digitizing good processes, not bad processes, will be very key. So there's no misgiving, or in no way are we hiding behind technology. The remaining 75% is what we need to focus on.
If you look at the private sector, I'm sure you have more experience on this than me. If you look at the private sector in comparison to the government sector, we see the resistance to change being much, much lower in private sector, often contributing to the fast adoption of technologies and change in general as well. So do you think it's not a matter of them not wanting to change, but it's a matter of it being a conflict of interest? Because we have historically seen, you and I can both, I believe, see historical examples of places where the requirements or the necessities of a few people have been prioritized over the general public in Sri Lanka. This is a conventional problem that we have had for years now. So how do you plan to address that in this transformation?
Yes, there can be conflict of interest. There could be opportunities for corruption in a non-digitized system. But I like to think that we need to think the best of people. When you approach change, you need to approach it with a belief in people, and you need to have that conversation with every segment, and the leaders of these organizations have to have that conversation with all their employees. So this is why we are doing something, and this is for the betterment, and let's do it together. And that's how we do it in the private sector. There's maybe some form of incentivization, which again I think should apply even in the government sector. But I don't think we have one type of Sri Lankan in the private sector and another type in the government sector. We are all one, and it's only asymmetries in information that we have, asymmetries in the training that we have or the education that we have, and we must quickly eradicate those asymmetries, and through that I think you will get the belief in change. And just like in the private sector, if there are always those people who are left behind because they do not want to change, and that again cannot be prevented. So I have every confidence that, from my experience also, days in Dialogue starting way back in '94, and Dialogue is a company with, and continues to be a company that has Sri Lankans from all walks of life, from the most qualified to all the way down to the little 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗓𝗦𝗓 village. It's all one ecosystem, and so do many other FMCG type companies in Sri Lanka. And if you ask any of them, I believe that you'll get the answer that we all had and have great belief in the Sri Lankan people and their capacity to absorb new things. But it's on us to build that capacity, to educate, to provide the tools, to make it convenient, easy, and meaningful.
Right. I hope to see your efforts transforming into the efforts to digitize Sri Lanka. Good luck, and thank you very much for joining with us today, Dr. Hans. And that's it for this episode of The Exchange. Thank you for tuning in.